organism management. So the session has been dealt by the NTNU Norway, so calling staff. Then we're also live on stream now, that on YouTube, managed by Magna Grecia University, and then our partner is also Lancaster University. So I'll give you the floor, Colin, to introduce Ludger. Thanks a lot and enjoy the conference.
Great, thank you, Giuseppe, and thank you everyone for joining us. So, what can I say? So I'll make a few kind of more organizational points at the end of this session. A couple of points are that this is set up so that you can only interact in the Q&A, unfortunately, as a participant, if you're one of the participants here. But if we have time, and you wave your hand, I can let you ask questions. We've been trying to get Ludger to be a keynote at this conference, I think, for as long as the conference has been going, and it's never quite worked out. So we're delighted to finally have him here, but also it's kind of bittersweet that we don't really have him here, but we have him online. So I'm not going to say so much. Ludger's very well known to anyone who works in the economics of education. He's director at IFO, professor at University of Munich, and he's essentially responsible for a whole range of research which brings together economics of education work with more macro and cross-country concerns, amongst other things. So, a range of very influential work on education and economic growth. And when I teach graduate education, we spend some time thinking about cross-country differences. It's essentially 2 weeks discussing Ludger's work. So I'm delighted to have him here. He's going to talk today about, can mentoring alleviate family disadvantage in adolescence? So Ludger, the floor is yours. I will mute myself. Apologies. At the moment we should start, Ludger has dropped out. So this is, let me just find him again. Well, that's an unexpected event. So we'll just wait for 2 seconds here. Yes, he's just told me that he's sent to this point, his computer just decided to lock up. What I will say, so for those attendees here who are participating later in the conference, I will set up some, you should have the links. If you go in, the only important thing to know is that if you're a presenter, we need to grant you host status, co-host status before you enter the breakout rooms. Not a problem. If you go into one and come out, we can fix that. Look, there we have you back.
Oh my, the wonderful.
Perfect timing.
Your computer fully crashes, everything frozen while you're in the meeting. Okay.
No.
So I guess
yeah,
I can start now. I missed all your nice or not so nice words, whatever he told you. It's probably been all wrong, whether good or bad. All right. Colin, you've got to allow me to share my screen again. That doesn't seem to work right now.
Okay. Yeah, should be right now.
Yeah, perfect. Oh my, okay. And now, even on top of this, I've been trying a new gadget that I've tried out over the weekend, and I hope it's going to work for you. Let's wait and see how this is working. All right, thanks so much for having me. I've been so much looking forward to finally go to Catanzaro. Okay, it's not happening, but at least I'm meeting you in terms of this presentation. I guess the one thing that does work online is people presenting their work to others. let's hope a little bit of discussion will work as well. Of course, what's not working, as well as having the coffee breaks and everything, which is really the thing why I was looking forward to this conference. So I so much hope to see all of you in the not too distant future in real terms. But until then, okay, let me just was actually thinking, like, should disadvantaged youth, particularly, so not very young kids, but adolescents. So in our case, they are 14 years old, to improve their future prospects, particularly with a explicit view of improving labor market outcomes. I mean, the background here, I guess it's pretty clear to all of you. Inequality has been proven to be pretty persistent across generations in most countries. And if you wonder about it, that's certainly also true for countries that do have extensive social welfare systems, where probably Germany is the case, but actually we, on most measures of persistency, we've got very high persistence, so very low mobility. And I think when you start thinking about these kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, an important characteristic, and not just one characteristic, it's really a defining characteristic, is that they lack the family support that is so powerful for other children, and that these other children just receive by what Jim Heckman has called the accident of birth, and they don't. And because of this, because this is kind of that defines to have a disadvantaged background, really, to be honest, any policies have very strong limitations. So it's just the basic point is no policy can just substitute or change parents. So whatever schools are going to do, they're not going to substitute the parents. And even directly family targeted programs cannot fully do that. And so, as we all know, those interventions that have proven to be reasonably successful, they usually try to compensate this lack of family support already very early in life. So early childhood interventions seem to be one of the aspects that are successful. By contrast, I mean, I think the state of the art, which is probably reasonably well described, is that later interventions in general, be there in schools, at least in secondary schools, or then later on the labor market, are much less successful, to the extent that they often don't have any impact on these really, really disadvantaged students. So these are kids that are often seen as basket cases. The schools have given up on them. And now that's a really frustrating, I think, point of view from society. Like, okay, you haven't really managed to intervene in early childhood education, so is it all too late? But I think it's fair to say that research has given pretty little attention to a specific type of later interventions that actually do try to provide personal support from other adults. So that enter directly this defining characteristics that these kids lack powerful support from other adults, that they build a relationship to talk with and so on. And so that's kind of the approach that mentoring programs try to go through. They try to provide the support that these disadvantaged family environments usually do not provide. And so we want to try to test in this project whether this actually can work. And I think we know pretty little about that. We can talk about that later. So what we do in this paper is we try to evaluate whether one specific mentoring program here is successful in improving what we call the labor market prospects of these very disadvantaged adolescents. And we implement an RCT on a nationwide mentoring program run in Germany. I'm going to give you the details in a minute, but just to see where we're heading, let me give away the main results. So if you split our sample of participants in this mentoring program in half of being very, very low SES and somewhat higher SES, we see very strong positive effects of the mentoring program for the low SES adolescents, we see significant increases in the 3 outcome dimensions that we have pre-specified and which we chose because they are highly predictive of later labor market success in the data sets that we can look at. So these kids are still in school, so we cannot yet directly observe their labor market outcomes, but we define these 3 outcome dimensions that we think are very relevant and predictive of later market outcomes. The first one is math grades in school, so a cognitive component, and then like a more non-cognitive component, namely patience and social skills, which are increasingly important on modern labor markets. And the third one is more like a volitional or motivational component, like labor market orientation, whether these kids at all start to think about the future in this way. And if we do look at a combined index of all these outcomes, we see a positive treatment effect of roughly half a standard deviation after 1 year. So this is huge. So these are certainly not basket cases. They are all these things are malleable, and mentoring seems to be one way to get at that. We do a mediation analysis, and at least part of the treatment effect seems to be mediated by the fact that these mentoring programs are successful in establishing mentors as an attachment figure to which these kids can talk to and provide guidance for the future. So this is a positive aspect. The other aspect is that in the kind of upper half of our participants, in these higher SES adolescents, we don't see any significant treatment effects. If anything, they go in the negative direction, but they are never significant. So what I basically want you to take away from all this is that it seems that individualized adult support that is successful in substituting family support where it is really lacking, so where kids are really low SES, does help these disadvantaged kids even at an adolescent age. So even not just early childhood interventions, but also a year later. And at an age where most school programs and then somewhat later, these like labor market intervention programs usually don't seem to be very successful. Okay, just super quickly, how I think this fits in what we know so far and what has been done so far is actually, of course, there's a lot of work on mentoring. More recently, there's been several very nice papers, programs that you see here that study mentoring, where mentoring really is part of a comprehensive support program. So it's combined with financial incentives, with tutoring, with additional educational services, which is a nice thing, may actually make sense, but then we're never going to know which part of these things, or maybe their combination, is important. So we don't really learn here what role mentoring is playing in itself. And then most work that's been done on pure mentoring programs is non-experimental. There's lots of stuff outside of economics on this. And I think the main exception is the famous Big Brothers, Big Sisters programs. There have been a couple of evaluation of that, RCTs. They're, pretty old by now. And are very specific in a sense, really. I don't want to go to the details here, but the point is, this program is not particularly aimed at improving labor market prospects, and they actually don't see much in these dimensions in any case. So our program is explicitly focused on helping these kids making the transition to the labor market, and I think we as economists are also super interested in that. I think from the life chances of these kids, that's a super important dimension to look at, and I'm not aware of papers that have looked at that. Just to mention, there's been a couple of recent super nice mentoring studies in the elementary school context, but as I kind of motivated, what I think is an important additional aspect is like, is there anything working at a later age? And there's also like this related literature on tutoring programs, but at least conceptually they are very distinct. Maybe in reality they sometimes overlap a little bit. So tutoring is not about building relationships or anything, but it's about instruction of academic content. It's really just like schooling on a one-to-one or small group basis targeted at certain kids, which like there's a recent review by Nico Oreopoulos and others showing that these have often been shown to have pretty decent effects on academic outcomes, but question is really like to what extent it goes beyond. And here I want to see whether like this mentoring idea is a quite different idea, at least in terms of how you approach these things. So what is it, to be very concrete here? The mentoring program that we evaluate is called Rock Your Life. Like in Germany, it's even called with this English name, Rock Your Life. It's been founded by a group of university students like a bit more than 10 years ago. But they scaled up pretty fast, and since then have set up more than 7,000 mentoring relationships. It's one of the biggest mentoring programs in Germany. It's one-to-one mentoring. So they target these adolescents, and these adolescents get one mentor, and these are voluntary university students who do that. The adolescents are on average 14-year-olds. In Germany, they are like, we have this track school systems, high track, medium track, low track, whatever. And so what these mentoring sites do, they look at each in their respective university town, go to the most disadvantaged neighborhoods, and there look for the lowest track schools, and then approach these adolescents and ask them whether they would be interested in this mentoring program. And this is meant to run first for 1 year with an optional second year if they want to continue. And it's usually like implemented in the last couple of years in school. That's the main idea here, because compulsory schooling in Germany, at least in these general schooling, ends after, well, no, usually after grade 10, used to be after grade 9 really. And then they can either enter an apprenticeship or go on with upper secondary schooling. And so this is really then the main objective and the explicit objective of this program. That's what it was set up for. It aims to achieve. And therefore, we evaluating this program on their own target, not on something else that we may be interested, but not them, which is also different from some other evaluation studies that have recently been done. So the main aim is to prepare these adolescents for a successful transition into professional life. Like, it's a holistic approach, but it's really meant to prepare them for professional life, which in Germany usually leads this transition from lower secondary school into, for these kids from these schools, into an apprenticeship usually. That would be the major successful transition, or they may go on to upper secondary school even. And just to give you an idea of how relevant this outcome is in Germany, like if you even in the boom time before the recent recession, unemployment rates of those who didn't successfully complete an apprenticeship in Germany were close to 20%, whereas once you have an apprenticeship, average unemployment rate is 3 to 4%. And those of if you have in higher education, it's 2%. But it's really, this is the one big step you need that usually allows you to get a decent job on the German labor market. And so the program aims to support these adolescents to develop their individual potential. This is kind of what they, like, one of their buzzwords. It's about like each adolescent has some potential, and we want to help them to develop that, to develop their personal skills, but also to improve the school situation, even though it's like an indirect aim. And so the core of the program is really these regular meetings between mentors and mentees, which are meant to be happening more or less every other week. And they are focused on career orientation, on school assistance, and leisure activity. So really, they usually would start out meeting, like going to the cinema or going to the zoo together to build this relationship between mentor and mentee. And then they would start talking about things about what they want to do in life, whether they've ever thought about that, and trying to give them then starting to get a more realistic perspective. And therefore, actually, it's not there's not a clear toolkit of what exactly they are doing there. Their whole point is that each of these kids has their individual perspectives, individual problems, and they want to approach this individually by talking with them and then understanding what might be the things that motivate them to actually go to a certain direction, and then to get a realistic direction, and then help them really start to make the steps that they need to do to get there. And so from our surveys, what we learn is basically the topics that are most often mentioned as being discussed in these meetings is school issues, 2/3, say so, leisure activities, future in general, occupational and educational future in particular, and personal issues. So all these are things that they would discuss in here. So it's not, in that sense, a tutoring program, although, like, if you start talking about these with these mentors, some would say, like, oh yeah, and then we started to talk about, you know, they wanted to be a model, but at the end of the day, they realized they couldn't be it. But then, for example, they would start talking about, but something that's kind of related and would motivate them is becoming a hairdresser. And then you start about, well, what do you need to achieve in school to get an apprenticeship as a hairdresser? And which, like, grades do you need to get? And then they all of a sudden realize, you know, well, but I'm not doing so well in this or one subject. And they would even then sometimes sit together and basically do tutoring, although it's not the main and explicit part of the program. So this whole program is organized as a social franchise, meaning there's a centralized concept and support structure. And so, for example, these mentors get some initial training, not very long, but a couple of days initially on how to approach and talk to these disadvantaged children. But then also, for example, whenever they have problems, they could like talk to somebody there to see how to get out there. And there's more trainings as they go along during the first year. But then this program is really implemented in very self-governing locations. And by now it's more than 40 across Germany, so all kind of university towns. And they decide on every specific thing, which actually made it much harder for us to implement the RCT on the ground, as you're going to see in a minute. So what did we do? So this was a program. Now, like, how do we try to approach to evaluate it? So we collected data in 10 different locations all across Germany, in 7 different states, in 2 cohorts. All of that was like we initially did our calculations and decided one cohort will not be enough. We had a couple of pilot schools to begin with. So actually at the end of the day, like, the whole data collection started, so the project started in early 2015 to some extent. And then like the first pilot school was in the field in 2015. And by the final data collection ran until 2020. So it's been a very intensive, long project. We didn't want to go just to one site or a couple of sites because you never know how generalizable these things is, but really to get their usual thing. I'm not quite sure whether this is something I want to recommend to everybody of you to do. It is certainly, I think you learn much more about it because you're more sure that you haven't just picked one location that's particularly good or something. So we really did like try to get a usual settings there. On the other hand, it was so much more work for our team to organize this and to do the data collection. You're going to see in a second, maybe at least a little bit of the pain that everybody went into. So in order to randomize, we relied on local program oversubscription. So when I first met with these people, like whatever, I think probably in 2014 or something, and they were literally like interested in saying, we want to have a real evaluation of whether our stuff works. And I told them I would be happy to do that. But to get a convincing control group, of course, I've been working a lot with like quasi-experimental ideas of how you get convincing control groups. But in this case, I can't see how you get there, because if they are successful in really getting at these very disadvantaged kids, I mean, you would just have like a handful of these in your usual data set, or you're never going to reach them. And so I told them the only way to really be convincing, we have to go and do an RCT. And of course, as always, there's many more kids in need than they could offer support to. And I told them, well, then the one ethical thing to do is really do it by a lottery. Whenever there's more kids who want to get into the program, then you have mentors. And that's what we did, which also means, for example, at any site and any location, when there were as many mentors as there were interested adolescents, they would all be treated and we would lose them for our evaluation, literally, which actually happened in a couple of sites, which basically reduced the number of observations, where we did like observe them, but they are not included in any of what we are doing here. But so whenever there were more kids than mentors, we randomized participation into the thing. But otherwise, our RCT did not alter any of the elements of the program or of the recruitment or anything. We just didn't intervene. They just did the usual thing. What we did is then, before program start, we did a baseline survey of all adolescents. So like the program went to the local schools, talked to them. So like, okay, everybody who's interested now has to apply. And then we did a baseline survey of all those who had expressed interest to be in there. This was actually, again, given that these are locally organized, each wave and each location started at a different time. Usually they would start in October or November, but then some even in February or March. And so we just followed what they were doing and then go to that city and do a pen and paper survey administered by our project team in a school context. So we had to apply for this, getting into the schools within each of the German states to get allowance to do that, like you do these 50-page applications to get there. But we ultimately did get into this context. The nice thing with the school context is that we can later actually approach many more of these kids and hope to have very little attrition. You're going to see in a second that was actually the case. And then we did the treatment assignment within each site and cohort. So this already means that our randomization is perfectly matched on region and on local environments. They are basically in the same neighborhood there in the same school. And then we actually did a pairwise matching design, 3 randomization. So basically, you've got maybe 20 potential participants, you've got 10 slots in the specific location, and then based on some observables we have in our baseline survey, we did this pairwise matching, which first of all increases efficiency, and even if you've got then dropout or attrition, you can basically drop the whole pair and at least contain internal validity. And then basically, so we build these statistical twins and then just like randomly assign one of them into the program and the other one out of the program. It's something that's like particularly in relatively small RCT samples, highly recommended. And as you're going to see in a minute, like it gives you just wonderful balancing. So in total, we have 308 adolescents who were randomized in our randomized sample in these 10 locations. They were like in 19 different schools in 2 cohorts. Main study period for the first cohort is 2016 to 18, for the second cohort, 2017 to 19. Well, let me not bore you with all the details here. By the way, you can see, of course, we just have like a couple of months ago have a working paper first version out there with all the details. We've got lots of appendices, 130 pages, so it's basically a whole book. So anything I'm not talking about here, have a look there. Hopefully it's going to be in there. And then like we put in a lot of effort to actually reach all these participants 1 year after program start. So literally we had more than 100 person trips from our team to these participating schools for different parts of the data collection process, which meant we ultimately recontacted 304 of the 308 participants, at least in one way or the other. So it's basically a recontact rate of 99%. And this has actually 2 elements. We did our own follow-up survey in the same pen and paper situation 1 year later in the specific schools, where we reached about 95% of the kids. And then we also got permission, which is not that easy in Germany, to collect administrative grade information from the schools. So we had to go to the school archives and get it out there, much more complicated than I initially thought, which again, we get for a bit more than 95%. And just to give you a very quick idea here of the balancing. So we basically, the matching is done just on a few variables, and then you've got some balancing variables in the re-randomization. This is all the stuff that's in here, like gender, age, migrant status, and then prior grades and so on. And of course, we are perfectly balanced on this one. This is more or less by construction, but then like we have all the variables that we use for our evaluation later on. We have baseline values in terms of these later outcome variables, and you're going to see them here. I'm going to talk about them in a minute, but also all of them are super nicely balanced, as are other big 5 items and so on that we have in the baseline there. So that looks good. So how, like, what do we want to evaluate the program on? I already told you that they are kind of explicitly want to help these kids make the transition into professional life. And so when, like in our setup, we actually pre-specified 3 outcome dimensions that we want to look at, because these kids are still in school, and it's literally the way the system is set up in Germany is going to be another 3-4 years until they're literally, you get some idea of how they're doing in the labor market, because there's all these in-between systems that may or may not be successful. And so we kind of define these 3 dimensions, which are highly predictive of adolescents' later labor market success. And actually, we have one part in our appendix, which is basically an own individual paper showing that each of these things are significantly related and strongly related to later labor market outcomes in the German PIAC data, so these adult teaser type of data we have. And so the first component is kind of like, it's mostly a cognitive component, of course, not purely cognitive, but given the other stuff we have, this is what goes in the cognitive way. And that's simply the math grades in school. So we collected the math, like in the kids' grades in math in each of the schools. This is administrative data. So it's not any self-reported way or anything like that. And the way I'm going to show it here is like all the things are going to be standardized, and like in Germany, the best grades is 1 and the worst is 6, but actually we're going to reverse this. So whenever you see anything, better is bigger, more positive. The second component is kind of what you could call a behavioral component, non-cognitive component. And there we collected the information in our own surveys, items on patience, so general future orientation, and items on social skills. And that is itself an index, has 3 components: pro-sociality, so other regarding behavior, it's just measured from the strength and difficulties questionnaire; trust, so it's a general trust in others; and self-efficacy, which is trust in own skills and abilities. And for all these things, we really just used well-established scales from other psychological questionnaire items that we then applied here. So we would use some of these from the German socioeconomic panel, some from other sources, and so on. We didn't make up any of this ourselves. And then there's a third component. That's something that actually, when like we started out talking to the guys who run these things, to them is very important, and I think it is in general. And that's more like a motivational or volitional component, because these kids are usually like, they hate school. They actually hate anything that's organized or otherwise. And so one aspect that's first of all just relevant is that these 14, 15-year-olds start thinking about the labor market at all, because for them the transition is going to be there in a couple of years at most, and so they should start at least making some thoughts about that. And this is going to be just like, it has just 2 items. The one is whether, like when we ask them what they want to do after school, is if they say an apprenticeship, so they actually have thought about that and want to go that direction. The other one is whether they know which occupation they want to work on later in life. So these are the 2 components that go into this third one. I'm going to start out showing results for a combined index of what we then call labor market prospects, and that's just an equally weighted average of these 3 components of the z-scores of them. So everything is z-scored. So this will basically allow us to show you the overall program effect, and particularly to go around any multiple hypothesis testing, because we just throw everything into one basket and test it on this one index outcome. But I'm also going to show you results for these 3 aspects separately. In the paper, you're going to see it for each of the individual items. You can look at that, of course, as well. But but then, of course, you get into like many hypotheses. We do in the appendix multiple hypothesis testing when looking at the 3 individual components, and actually the results there survive multiple hypothesis testing as well. One final step we need before we can get to the results is actually to define or to think about the socioeconomic background of these kids. And so the program is explicitly targeted at very low SES kids, and that's where they hope to kind of support the missing family background. Basically, one of the results of our surveying here was that they kind of learned that they actually partly also reach kids that may be disadvantaged, but actually there's a less lack of family support. They actually, in most dimensions, you wouldn't call them super low SES. And there, just theoretically, it's even less clear. I mean, if they're not lacking that much family support at home, maybe mentoring is not the best intervention. And you could even think about ways where it would start crowd out other useful inputs, like when whatever they would otherwise do in the afternoon, though they meet this mentor, maybe it doesn't have positive effects, could even go negative. So it's not as clear there. And therefore, actually, and what I'm going to show you, we're going to break up the sample, like to make it easy, just into two rather equalized parts. And we take this one measure that's super simple, that I'm a big fan of, which is the number of books in the home. And so whenever I'm going to talk about low ICS here, it's going to mean they have the lowest two categories of the six categories of books at home, which is less than 25 books at home, which in our sample is 47% of the sample. And then higher SES is the other 53%. They have at least 25 books more than 25 books at home. And if you compare that to a standard representative sample like the PISA sample here, it would mean like the low SES is actually only 23% in a standardized sample. So the modal person in this group, in our low SES group, would probably be around the 11th percentile of the distribution of any cohort. In the appendix, again, we have results for a broader SES index based not just on books at home, but also parental education and parental employment status. There's many reasons why you would probably not trust, for example, the parental education that much. More than half of the kids have a migration background, so parents got this education in many different countries and so on and so forth. You've got many more missing values there. You can, like we discuss it in the paper, why actually my preferred measure is the SES one, is the books one, but actually the main results are just the same if you do this broader index. So it's not depending on this. Okay, let's go to the broad set of results that we have here. So here's in the full sample, the outcome measure is this index of labor market prospects with all three components. It's Z standardized in the control group, so meaning it's 0 here in the full sample in the control group, and you see we have on average a treatment effect of some 15% of a standard deviation, which is marginally significant at the 10% level. But this marks this huge heterogeneity in effects by socioeconomic status. So here's the lower SES half of the sample, where you can already see they are much more disadvantaged, like in the outcome dimension in these labor market prospects to begin with. In the control group, it's like nearly a quarter of a standard deviation below the sample mean. And you've got a huge treatment effect of roughly half a standard deviation, statistically highly significant. So they improve strongly on these measures. And here's the results in the other half of the sample, the higher SES sample. They were more advantaged to begin with, of course, like by definition here, or like from what you've seen before. But if anything, you see a reduction in their labor market prospects. It's basically, we're going to see that for anything that I'm going to talk to you about here now. So there, it goes in the negative direction, but it's never statistically significant. That's basically what it is. Although there's like a couple of indications that I'm going to talk maybe about in the end, that there may be something real about the negative thing in here, but it's like much smaller, and well, we don't have the power to say much about that. So it's mostly insignificant. If you don't like this parametric things, I'm going to go like, this is the one picture where you see the full distributions. I think it's always nice to see that, although actually then I'm going to revert back to parametric estimation. So the top three panels here is the distribution of the labor market prospects in the baseline survey, so before treatment start. So the nice thing is we have observed all that before program start. Here's the full sample. Here's in the middle is the low SES sample, and at the right is the higher SES sample. And you can see everything is nicely balanced, so that's how it should be. And the bottom three are the same things after treatment, 1 year later in the follow-up survey. And you see, yeah, that like the treatment group is shifted somewhat to the right in the full sample. Even here, like the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test is significant at the 10% level, just as in the parametric version, showing that, yeah, there is some shift, but it's marginally significant. But then you really see it's like this big difference. Look at the low SES sample picture here. It's just very clear that the whole distribution is shifted strongly to the right, just big time. And at the same time, there's basically nothing going on in the higher SES sample. And the negative treatment effect we are seeing, in a sense, is based on this somewhat funny additional distribution out here, like something you would slightly already see up there. But this is like just super insignificant. So this is basically, you can see the treatment effects in this picture very clearly. It used to be like this. After treatment is like this. All right, so here's just a regression analysis for what I've basically just shown you to give you a quick idea of these things. This is the first column, just regressing our index of labor market outcomes on a treatment indicator, on a higher SES indicator and their interaction. So basically here you can basically see that in the control group, there's a gap of nearly half a standard deviation in the outcome between the high and low SES group. So this is the SES gap that's there in our sample. And the treatment effect here is 0.55 of a standard deviation. Statistically highly significant. You can also do it by randomization inference. That's what you have in brackets down here, but it's like very, very clear that this is there. And the effect is as basically closes the full SES gap that we have there in the sample full scale. And then by contrast, the treatment effect is like significantly lower and much lower in the higher SES sample. And at the bottom here is basically the treatment effect. It's just like the difference between the two for the higher SES, and that's minus 0.2 of a standard deviation. So it's not even small. But it's statistically not significant, and that's basically what we're going to see throughout. So this is a simple specification without anything else in there. Of course, we can do much more based on what we've been doing, but it should make a difference, and it doesn't make a difference. So basically, you're going to see like the treatment effect up there just remains the same. Whether we put in like our measurement of the outcome variable in the baseline survey. Which is very highly predictive of the outcome, as should be, but still doesn't change anything about the treatment effect, as also should be if you've got nice randomization as we have. And you can basically see that the R squared here goes up quite a bit, so this is very relevant. It tells you that like the data is meaningful, but doesn't change the treatment effect. Then we can put in these randomization pair fixed effects. So it's like basically for these 304 observations, it's always two, sometimes it's actually three in one pair. And so we basically can now put in a full set of fixed effects for all these pairs whenever like one of them is in the program and the other one isn't. So effectively you put in more than 150 fixed effects in here, even though you've got just twice as many observations. This of course boosts the R squared, just like by definition, the way we set it up, and it doesn't change the treatment effect. And then you can add covariates that you observe in the baseline. Again, doesn't do much. Of course, as always, this is intention to treat effects. Not all of the kids take up treatment. Like maybe the broadest way of defining treatment is if they ever at least met their mentor once. That's actually true for, I think, 86% of the kids. So 14% never even start the mentoring relationship. And so we can do an IV here for treatment on the treated, which is just scaling up the treatment of the ITT effect by the inverse of the participation rate. So they literally get a treatment effect, treatment on the treated of more than 2/3 of a standard deviation. And it's actually true that actually there's still in there's going to be quite a few kids who actually drop out relatively early. This is actually part of a problem of the program in general. Okay, this was this main index. I told you it's 3 components. Let's look at the 3 components individually. This is the first one, math grades. It's just simple as that. And you see a treatment effect of 0.29 of a standard deviation, so statistically significant here. Whereas, and you see the same pattern. The treatment effect is significantly lower for the higher SES kids, and it's actually like small, not super small, but small negative for them. And you can look at the entire distribution of these math grades. So this is like kind of getting an A at least, getting at least a B, at least a C, at least a D, and you basically see the treatment effect throughout the distribution. This is the second component, patience and social skills. Again, a significant positive treatment effect of 0.44 of a standard deviation on these low SES kids, and no significant treatment effect on high SES kids. This index has two parts. We see it's like on the one part on patients, we see a strong effect, also 0.44 of a standard deviation. Whereas on social skills, it's smaller and doesn't reach significance at usual levels. It's like 0.22 as the index, and actually it's the three components of the social skills index. You see positive point estimates each, but never reach significance. And here's the third component, this labor market orientation. You even see a significant treatment, marginally significant treatment effect there. So you literally see this positive treatment effect on each of the three components individually of 0.29. And that's really just driven by this one aspect of when we ask them what they want to do after school, they say they want to do an apprenticeship. There we see this treatment effect where we don't see any effect on they already know which occupation they want to go into later, like want to work in later in life. Okay, there's lots of additional results. Let me just drop that looking at the time. Maybe I've got another 5 minutes before I should complete. And I rather want to talk about the mechanisms a little bit. So we do a mediation analysis in the paper, basically just a Techman and Pinto approach where the basic idea is like you observe several things that could be mediators. I mean, basically the first thing is you just throw them into the regression and see how much your treatment effect changes. But then, I mean, we can look at the treatment effects on these mediators. They are well identified because we've got an RCT. The open question is then the second step, but you need that for a mediation analysis, whether these mediators are at all relevant for the outcome. And that, of course, is not causally identified. You have to make this assumption, actually just like in any traditional analysis we've ever done, that any mediator that you don't observe is exogenous to the mediators that you do observe, which I think is a strong assumption. So think of this as a descriptive analysis, but even in this descriptive sense, it tells us something about which dimensions may or may not be relevant here. And so we basically look at in our questionnaires that we have in our surveys on aspects that of this mentor-mentee relationship that could be mediators in the way that they actually literally facilitate this transition into professional lives. And so basically we picked up 3 mediators. All 3 of them are significantly actually affected by the treatment effect in the low ACS sample. And they kind of mirror the 3 dimensions that we're looking at really in a sense. So the first one is whether the mentee says that because of the mentor, they perceive school as useful for the job. The second is that the mentee says they talk to the mentor about the future. And the third one is that the mentee says that the mentor was important for them to think about job choice. And maybe like to quickly just let's look at this bottom row here, which is where we like include all 3 channels at the same time. What you basically then see is like they can, in this type of mediation analysis, they can account for about 1/3 of the total treatment effect. So 2/3 remain unexplained by our observed factors. Not surprising, and it's not that we have the perfect ways of observing all possible mediators, but at least it is somewhat relevant. And you see that the biggest chunk of this mediation comes through the fact that the treatment effect, like the mentoring, like raises the likelihood that kids say that they talk to the mentor about the future, and that actually whenever or wherever this is the case, we see that our treatments effect are very strong. It explains in itself 1/4 of the overall treatment effect. And the other 2 potential mediators also contribute, but to a much lesser extent. We also do this kind of a mediation analysis for this small and insignificant negative treatment effect in the higher SES sample. Of course, you look at different things there because you look for things that are actually negative. You basically, I mean, you see treatment effects in the higher SES sample for a couple of these as well, but actually they are then in that sample not correlated in general with outcomes. So they don't work as mediators. But we do see a couple of things. Namely, we see that at least marginally significantly, the program, there's a little bit of crowding out effects. First, on whether these kids participate in other social school activities, like meeting in the afternoon with certain things. So they do less of that because of the mentor-mentee meetings. And there's actually a marginally significant negative effect on parental attachments, on the extent to which they say they talk to their parents about the future. And just in this type of mediation analysis, like I wouldn't push it too far because like we are looking at small effects here, but it does account for roughly half of this small negative treatment effect. So there is some indication that literally this program had some effects on the higher SES kids in ways that are not positive. Final thing, another way to learn about mechanisms is to look at very directly on what the kids do in the mentoring relationships. Of course, we can do that only in the treatment group and not in the control group. Let me jump into this one table where you basically hear all sorts of aspects we asked about the mentoring relationship. And you see it for the low SES kids here and for the higher SES kids in here. So you learn at least a little bit of whether there's descriptively something different about their relationships with their respective mentors. And you see a couple of things that it's like there's a strong difference in whether the mentee says she's better at school because of the mentor. It's kind of twice as large a chunk among the low SES than in the higher SES. And the same, or like another big difference is whether they say that the mentor helped them to solve non-school related problems. And on most other dimensions of what's going on, there's actually not much difference between low and high SES kids. In particular, we don't see any significant differences in the frequency of the meetings or in the duration of the meetings. Literally, it's just not different between the high and low SES kids or in the topics discussed during the meetings. It's kind of amazing how similar these are in terms of like how many kids say they talk about school, they talk about the future in general, about personal issues, family issues. It's just the same. The one difference, and that's kind of also interesting, is that the low SES kids are much less likely to say that they talk to their mentor about leisure activities. If you put it the other way around, I mean, with the higher SES kids, these university students really start to talk about leisure stuff and so on, but that just doesn't help them too much. And that maybe is also some indication of maybe why it's not as effective among higher SES kids, but particularly why it's very effective among lower SES kids. So the takeaway from the mechanisms here is that mentoring is successful only if adolescents really lack adult support, and if they are successful in establishing this additional attachment figure, the mentor, with whom these kids can talk about the future. And it seems like these qualitative factors of the relationships, like whether they improve school and non-school related factors and so on, matter much more for the success of the program than the mere intensity, how often they meet and so on. Okay, I talked about the literature to begin with. Just to conclude, we do see that these labor market prospects of these very highly disadvantaged adolescents, age 14, are malleable. That's maybe the most important lesson. And this program has a huge effect of more than half a standard deviation on the three components, cognitive, behavioral, and volitional. And it's particularly when they substitute for start to build a relationship to talk about the future, where these mentoring relationships apparently can work even in these like very disadvantaged settings. And we don't see any treatment effects for the higher SES adolescents. You can do a back of the envelope cost-benefit analysis, just look at the lifetime labor market returns observed in observational data for better school grades, and we know the cost from the program. If you set it up in this untargeted way, like it's like the projected lifetime returns are 15 times higher than the cost of the program. If you would target it just on this low SES adults, it's 31-1. So like this is very rough, but it clearly indicates that the program would easily pay for itself. Final thought about scalability, which is of course always the question with these type of RCT interventions. I mean, the one thing is, of course, giving this strong heterogeneity by SES, when you start scaling, it will be very important to target at those who really lack family support. Otherwise, you're not going to get treatment effects. The other aspect, though, is that, I mean, this is a national franchise which grew pretty quickly from just one site to over 40 sites, and our RCT was not focused just on 1 or 2 sites. We like had more 10 sites. This all speaks in favor of scalability beyond a specific location. The one thing we should keep in mind, though, is that these are all cities with universities, so university towns. So scalability into more rural areas may be more of an issue, whether you find mentors there and so on. Okay, thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to present paper here. Hope it was interesting for you, and I hope we have got time for a couple of questions maybe.
Thanks, Luca. That was brilliant. Really interesting talk. We do indeed have time for a couple of questions. I see Hans has been typing away, so I will hopefully allow you to talk. And if you want to say something, and one thing I have to say is that because this is being streamed live, you have to essentially give consent to this being going live to ask you questions. So remain silent and type to me if that's a problem, but otherwise we'll assume we're fine. Hans first.
Okay, I'll try. I have some noise here. Thanks, Ludger. Very great talk. Oh, you hear this? No, maybe on your last point on validity, I was also thinking whether your sample where you could do the analysis was special in the sense that you had more students than mentors. Is that like specific regions with more problems, or is it just by chance? And could this also help you speak about regions without university?
Right. Oh, yeah. So we did look quite a bit into that. We just didn't see any observable differences between situations where the local situation was oversubscribed or not. So it's not that it's like very successful regions or whatever. So we just didn't see observable differences. So we actually think, and that was our thought to begin with as well, is that these are really the things that happen by chance, because like in 1 year there's just more kids around, or all of a sudden they are successful to finding more university students who are willing to do this. In other years they don't. And so, well, on the one hand, that's I guess it's good for us in the sense that it talks towards generalizability. On the other hand, it's not going to teach us much about scalability in like whether that depends on very specific situations and how you can work with that.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Makes sense. So the other point was on the, and maybe I missed it, on the high SES kids going to low track. Is that like a special group of high SES tracks kids? I would guess that many high SES kids go to the higher tracks in high school.
Absolutely. Well, that's a couple of things on that, but it's still that is really an open question to some extent. So first of all, like this is actually not high SES, it's higher SES. So it's not in this very bad group. There are a few in there literally where we can see that their parents are university educated and so on, which and you're right, it's kind of seldom that they would be in these schools. But what happens is after some reforms in some states, we don't have the 3-track system here in Bavaria. We still have Hauptschule, which is the bottom part, or it's called Mittelschule, but this is the very low part. Whereas in most other states, by now you've got more a unified school for everybody who's not in the top track school, not in gymnasium, and they have got different names in each state. And so even though this mentoring program still goes to these bad neighborhoods and so on to try to get in there, you will find some schools and some families going there that are really not that low SES, and they just didn't make it into gymnasium. Which then on the other hand, and that I think is an interesting point that would be worth exploring more, is what you say, what kind of kids are these where they are? So there are some high SES kids in there, I guess, who are in these schools, and why do they go there? And is it something special? So it may be that these have particularly honest learning programs. They may be actually very slow learners or something that otherwise, so they are disadvantaged in some other dimension, which is actually not their family background. But then it seems like mentoring then is also not the right thing for them. But it would be interesting to understand a bit better what these kids are. I fully agree. We don't fully understand that.
Thanks. Great talk. Very interesting.
Okay, Aspasia? Yeah?
Yes. Yes, can you hear me? Thank you, Ludger, for a very nice talk. I was wondering if you know anything about the quality of the mentor. So is there a way to check, I mean, how would you know if a mentor is better than another? And would you be able to say anything about sorting of mentors to say like the worst schools get the better mentors because these mentors want to have a challenge? Thank you.
Right. Yeah, this is a super interesting question. So the way they do, I mean, first of all, across schools, there's actually, so it's usually, so these university societies in their city go to 2 or 3 or 4 schools, and they are all basically equally disadvantaged. And so I don't think there's any sorting in that dimension. But of course, we would like to understand whether it depends on specific characteristics of these mentors, whether the treatment effects. And we haven't explored that very far. And also on the matching between mentors and mentees, so maybe in terms of their migration background or what have you. So in general, what most of these local locations do is they have a speed dating first time where actually all mentors and mentees are up there, and then they quickly match each other in terms of. And the question is whether that's super important for the success of this program or whether it's irrelevant, and we literally don't know. We actually thought about randomizing that as well, but I'm glad we didn't do that because we would never have the power to go anywhere there. But that means we can't say much about the matching. We do have, and we haven't started to explore that. For a subset of the mentors, we actually have a background questionnaire where we know a bit more about them. And we haven't fully linked it to our data yet. And then I fear the samples will be very small, but we hope to explore that further because I do agree that that's an important question.
Yeah, great, thanks.
I think we are almost done. Massimiliano Bratti asked some things there, a number of questions which you can forward on, but unless he chats back in a second, no, I think we're done. So once again, thank you so much, Luca, for a great talk. Great to have you at the conference, opening the conference, really, really inspiring. And we hope and pray that we can get you to Calabria and we can all meet there sometime in the not too distant future.
Yeah,
thanks so much.
I super look forward to that.
Okay, so everyone, I'm going to shut this down now. I'll open up these sessions so you can migrate over there after you have a coffee. And I look forward to many great talks. Okay, goodbye, everyone.